Welcome to the Yeoman Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Graham. On Yeoman, we'll speak with people who build and grow things, people who create art, and people who think about community, meaning, and purpose. Before we get into this afternoon's discussion, I have a request. In the spirit of building, growing, creating, and writing, I've launched a new venture. It's called Periodical, periodical.inc. That's Inc with a K. Combines your favorite blogs and Substacks into a personalized magazine-quality print publication and delivers it to you at your preferred frequency so that you can enjoy great and fascinating writing that's presently only available online at your leisure. So imagine your favorite digital media printed in a personalized periodical and delivered to you by mail. I have a caveat, so I say it does all that, but the truth is it's a work in progress, and it doesn't do all that quite yet. It is, however, far enough along that we're ready to have users running it through its paces. We still need to fine-tune some things like the PDF rendering functionality, and we have more work to do on gathering sources, but it's ready for people to start playing with it, and that's the only way we'll be able to make it really, really good. So if you're up for playing around with something that's in progress and you like the idea of getting your own personalized print publication, please visit periodical.inc. Again, Inc is with a K, and sign up. I know this crazy idea sounds anachronistic, but if you are the type of person who drives a manual transmission, if you have real doubts about what screens are doing to our brains, and if you own a scythe, my guess is you will like Periodical. Please go try it out. Again, periodical.inc. And thanks very much for that. And now on to our guest, whose blog is in my own periodical, by the way, Chris Smaje. You can find him at Chris Smaje, SMAJE.com. Chris, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks. Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So Chris is joining us from Somerset in southwest England. He's been a small-scale vegetable grower for about 20 years. And before that, he was a researcher and teacher in political science and policy. More recently, Chris has authored a couple books, one of which I have with me here today, 2020's A Small Farm Future, and also 2023's Saying No to a Farm-Free Future. I encourage you to check out both of these works and also his frequent writing at his own blog, and you can follow him on Twitter as well. Chris, I'm delighted to have you. Thank you so much for joining me. And I had said I was going to ask you to begin with kind of sharing the story of how you found your way to farming. That's not where you started your career. So please, if you will, let's dive in with that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, like a lot of people these days, I grew up in a kind of fairly suburban situation, and, farming just wasn't really part of my world growing up. I went to university, studied anthropology, so that kind of, I suppose, drew me into an interest in kind of other cultures and people who are not necessarily living mainstream modern lives. Kind of got interested in peasant cultures, sort of dabbled a little bit in research, university, started doing a doctorate, didn't finish that, sort of went on to other things. But I kind of, so I sort of had this fairly intellectual interest in peasants and farming. I didn't actually know how to do it myself. But then, so I sort of had those kind of jobs you mentioned in universities, research institutes for sort of 10 years or so, and then kind of got drawn into thinking, partly issues about energy futures, geopolitics, climate change, and so on. I kind of felt like, the way that we were living in the modern world wasn't really the right way, and sort of got interested in small-scale local agriculture and food systems, sort of as a, I kind of felt like food is central to every community, and local food is a kind of missing piece of the jigsaw. So kind of slightly naively drawn into being a small scale grower, and that's sort of united the two parts really, the kind of social science, political science, systems thinking, where does all this fit in the big picture of the world, and sort of trying to articulate a vision for local small scale farming, community based initiatives, and all the rest of it. Yeah. So that's me in a nutshell. So in one way or another, I've been doing that for 20 odd years, and increasingly sort of writing about it as well.
Well, tell me about your farm.
Well, we've just got a little kind of small holding homestead, 18 acres, on the edge of a small town, in Somerset, Frome. So my wife and I bought it, 20 years ago. It was just a kind of big sweep of pasture. The main commercial thing we've done is have a little market garden. I mean, it's only sort of acre and a half or so. So we grow veg, and sell it to folks locally. We've got a little bit of livestock that we raise mostly for ourselves. About 7 acres of trees that we planted on the site, sort of mix of forest and nut and fruit trees. And we've sort of built a little community up on the site over years. I mean, one issue is sort of zoning restrictions, and, initially the powers that be didn't allow us to live on the site. So, it's been a bit of a sort of battle with bureaucracy all along the way to be able to live on the site and build a community. And that's kind of the problem writ large in a way, really, with modern agriculture, is it's all been about getting people off the land, getting people into towns. And, my argument essentially is that we need to go the other way. We need more people on the land, producing food and fiber, other useful things for local community consumption, not for sort of big, global commodity markets. But it's been a bit of a struggle to make it happen from scratch, especially without a farming background. So I suppose part of my writing has been about thinking about that longer term, and sort of how it kind of fits into the wider way the world is going, and hopefully making it easier for people coming after. I tend to think of zoning, particularly onerous and exclusionary zoning, as a particularly American thing. I'm surprised to hear that has been a challenge for you. And also I'm interested, you say you're building a community. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Yes. So the thing to remember with zoning, here in the UK, we're a pretty small, densely populated country. We're smaller than some single US states with a population of 70 million. So if there weren't restrictions on building in the countryside, the place would probably turn into a car park. But the trouble is the powers that be are not always very subtle in the way that they navigate that. So it can be hard. They're very geared to big scale, intense farming, and so, a few people living on an acreage, trying to do some local food production doesn't quite tick their boxes. So that can be a struggle. The community side of it, is partly, I don't know, I guess, my wife and I have, we live in a house with, most of our kids are grown and gone now, but, we've sort of had a kind of a conventional family life, but also like to be around other people. And, as I was saying, really the way to make local food work is to have more hands on deck, more people on the land. So we've sort of tried various ways to bring people on board. Yeah, it's difficult. If you're the owner of the land, then obviously other people don't necessarily have such a stake in it. If you're not the owner of the land and it's an equal community, then, communities tend to fall apart, quite regularly, if nobody, if everyone has to agree on everything. So that's something that, has been sort of tricky to navigate. And part of it also is that there's not a lot of small scale horticultural training available, here in the UK, or probably in the US also, so part of it has been about trying to find models to enable people to learn about small scale growing and then to sort of go on and start their own market gardens. So we've sort of, wrestled with that in various ways and, just often had sort of interesting people. If you've got a bit of land, you get a lot of people with an interest in coming onto it and doing some of it. And, sometimes their ideas are like, nope, that's not going to happen. But other times, it can be interesting to just, let people be on for a period of time and see what happens. And so we've tried to be open to those wild possibilities a little bit. So that's the story.
In your work, your books and your articles that you write, you use a term that I have to say, you use the term peasantry. Mm-hmm. And I think you talk about it without pretty clear-eyed, and not in a idealistic way. But I have to say, I confess that when I hear that term, it evokes kind of things like sort of subjugation and hierarchy and those sorts of things. And I get the strong sense that you do not mean it that way, or don't mean it entirely that way. And if you could, can you elaborate on what you mean by when you talk about peasantry?
Sure. It's difficult because there's no ideal word really that captures the kind of thing that I think we need to be talking about. Stephen Stoll's book on the history of Appalachia was very good on that, I thought, where he said part of the problem is that all of these words, peasant, yeoman, agrarian, whatever, they have negative connotations, or they sound archaic or whatever. So there isn't an ideal term, but I mean, for sure, I recognize, there is a history of agrarian subjection. And that's partly why people left the land and sort of, urbanized and industrialized, although often enough, they didn't have much choice. It was, it was not it was not a free choice to leave the land, though people were forced in various ways, I sort of use the word agrarian localism a bit more nowadays, but I guess the thing I'm reaching for is kind of what we've been talking about, people who are proprietors, people who have, we can talk about property ownership maybe, and that, raises a host of questions, but basically people who have secure tenure on some land and have the ability to be self-determining, to make autonomous decisions, to plan long term about what they're going to do with it. Not necessarily wealthy people, in fact, generally not. Recognizing that often people are constrained by aristocracies or whatever historically, but increasingly that's it's almost like this thing is inverting. People talk about the precariat. If you look at kind of slum dwelling globally, if you look at the precariousness of urban wage laboring life, the kind of the sort of story that I think you're alluding to historically, which, certainly has some grains of truth to it, is that people were, under other people's thumbs on the land and sort of upstick, went to the city, were more prosperous. I mean, people always go to where they can find peace and prosperity. And historically, that's been obviously the history of the US, people moving from Europe, or, to the US for a better life, people moving away from subjection on the land to a better life in the city. But I think that's been a relatively short-term story. It's not necessarily going to be the story of the future. In some ways, I think the story of the future is going to be the opposite of that. It's going to be people looking for peace and prosperity on land, and the key to that is having, as I say, secure tenure, secure property rights of some kind, ideally as part of a larger community of people who are doing similar things. So that's what I'm trying to get at. But I agree, there are no ideal terms for it. The ideal terms have been sort of squashed by history.
So you wrote, this is on page 60 of your first book, A Small Farm Future. I won't read the long part, but this is in the subchapter of your book, 10 crises, in the subchapters, the history of capital. It's almost as a throwaway line. You say that you refer to the 17th century as the golden age of English yeomen. Right. But you don't go on to elaborate on that. And of course, given the title of this podcast and my focus, I was like, I have to ask you what you mean by that.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I was quite influenced by the historian Robert Allen, who wrote a really interesting book called Enclosure and the Yeoman. I guess his book was part of a bigger debate about agricultural development or capitalist development in England, England being one of probably the earliest country to switch to a kind of urban industrial modern way of life. And the sort of classic argument that emerged in the 60s was that, there was all these small scale, yeomen, or we could call them peasant farmers. They weren't very productive. And, we had a more commercial agriculture that came in the 18th century. This was the argument that was being put forward by historians in the 60s. Bigger farms, more mechanization, more up-to-date methods. And Robert Allen basically said, no, that's not really what happened. Actually, a lot of the innovation was done by small-scale farmers in the 17th century, before all those enclosures, before all that engrossment. And I found his argument really interesting, and obviously it kind of suits some of my arguments about a small farm future. But essentially what he said was that there was a period earlier in English history. You've got to bear in mind, I'm not a historian or an expert on this, but I guess I've read around it quite a bit. At the end of the Middle Ages, kind of post Black Death, there was enclosure. The lords of the manor essentially tried to keep the agrarians, peasants, call them what you will, under their thumb by essentially grabbing their land. That led to a lot of agrarian unrest, and it led to the Tudor monarchy. And, you've got to bear in mind in the history of this that monarchies are often opposed to aristocracies, and they're trying to play off the ordinary people against the aristocracy to advance their own interests in developing a kind of central state. So the Tudor monarchy, Henry VIII and all that, they basically introduced something, copyhold, something akin to modern property rights that gave ordinary small-scale farmers exactly what I was just talking about, that secure access to land. And so Robert Allen says, that was very important, and that led, and that's kind of my argument in the Small Farm Future book that you mentioned. If you give people their head, if you give them the opportunity to really be a proprietor on a small patch of land, but give them secure access to it, they can be very innovative and they can be very productive. It's not true that you only get productivity with sort of big, big modern mechanized farms. Often those, they're not all that productive, in terms of per acre productivity. So Alan's argument was that 17th century period was the sort of golden age of the yeoman. And then it came to an end in the 18th century, essentially with the, I suppose with two things, partly the invention of mortgages, so that, if you can essentially, make a claim on the future, if you can leverage money, that gives an advantage to richer people. So it became very difficult for small farmers to, hold out against the money of the big landowners. And so a lot of small farmers sold up, and then you get that kind of process of urbanization and industrialization. But there was kind of a time lag between it. There was a lot of rural underemployment and misery in the 18th century here in England. And also, England as an emerging colonial power, it was drawing a lot of food basically, but also wealth in from the colonies, most of which was going into, your sort of classic image of the big English country house, that was built on this aristocratic ownership and the emerging colonial connection. And so that was kind of what did for the small scale proprietor in the 18th century. I mean, the term yeoman is interesting because I suppose it has a connotation of somebody who's quite commercially minded. They're not, in an English context, they're not necessarily just producing for themselves. They've got aspirations to be a sort of moneyed farmer. And that, I think, is the challenge that commerce in and of itself, I think, is a good thing, is a necessary thing. But once you allow it to get out of hand, once you allow people to over monetize, once you allow money to kind of fly around the world and sort of virtualize itself, and that's when we get into some of the problems of the modern age that we now face, where we need to kind of row back from that a bit and kind of rebuild local communities and local agrarianism.
Well, can we talk about that for a moment? I wanted to come to that a little later, but it's be a good segue. You let's see, talk about, let's see if there's an easily relevant quote here on modernity. It's and a little bit further on in that same chapter, you have a great passage on sort of what we think of as modernity and whether or not capitalism is a natural thing. And you said a couple things there that are particularly interesting to me, but I don't hear discussed often in a critique of capitalism. And other people have used the term turbo capitalism or even corporatism or cronyism. Mm-hmm. Like this, it seems to me like the great pitfalls of capitalism have followed the vast expansion of our supply chains and financialization, and as you used the phrase you used, the financial innovations that have enabled people to make a claim on the future.
Right.
And do you, when you talk about capitalism, are those things part and parcel to what you mean by capitalism, or are those things distinct from that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the way I think of capitalism, I mean, I suppose there's two contexts. One is the whole kind of 20th century post-war context of, particularly the US, or, the Cold War, essentially, that you have the sort of free capitalist West and the communist East. So if you if you say that you're anti-capitalist, there's that 20th century legacy of thinking, oh, well, then you must be communist or, support some sort of big state solution, mm-hmm. which I don't particularly. So I think we sort of need to detach capitalism from that historical context, but also from commercialism. Capitalism, I think, is almost exactly as the name implies. It is giving absolutely free rein to capital and the increase in capital. It's all about the increase in capital. So, that can be... sorry to interrupt, but is the formula that you write about in the book, I keep, I didn't
reading it, I didn't know how to pronounce it or say M arrow C arrow M prime. Is that what how would you that's what you're referring to right now, right?
Yeah, I mean, basically, yeah. So basically, capitalism pushes everybody to do whatever generates the biggest return on capital. And that can be, that can be, quite a positive thing, in terms of developing commerce. If you're a small scale farmer, maybe you want to have somebody who is a metal worker, or you can get your various inputs, some division of labor. This sort of all goes back to Adam Smith and his Wealth of Nations kind of stuff. In as much as return on capital can incentivize people to produce goods and services that other people genuinely want within a community, it can be a good thing. But that ultimately is not what capitalism is about. Capitalism is about maximizing the return on capital. And so we get, exactly as you were saying, ultimately it leads to sort of financialization, to sort of derivatives and futures markets and all this sort of, I'm not an economist or a finance person. I don't even really understand, some of the kind of crazy ways that modern finance works, but it is essentially.
I wish I did. I'm the same.
Well, yeah, it's, there's a great book by the American historian William Cronon about Chicago, where he kind of says in the 1830s, this was like a fur trading post on the frontier. By the 1850s, it had the first futures exchange. And I think by the 1860s, 70s, there were more grain futures traded in Chicago than actual grain, So it's this very rapid progress from, and obviously Chicago was very much the heart of modern agribusiness, kind of, linking beef and grain and, the development of modern transport, move and sort of refrigerated cold chain transport to the cities of the East and ultimately to around the world. So kind of initially it's, we can debate whether that was a good thing or not, and the extent to which it undermined more local food systems. But ultimately it becomes a kind of virtualized, financialized thing, and then money just starts kind of flowing around the world in search of more money, and that ultimately destroys farming. People talk about a sort of race to the bottom, and that's the reality of the agricultural sector in most parts of the world now, is that rather than having, fruits and vegetables and meat and, the kind of the basics of the agricultural economy that used to be produced locally, in most places, because, it's hard. It doesn't really make sense financially to transport it. Now, when I grow vegetables, here locally in Somerset, I'm basically competing with whoever in the world can produce those vegetables. Sure. More cheaply than me, and that probably is, it could be somewhere thousands of miles away, but that has a depressing effect on labor and community resilience and so on and so on. And it tends to make, create these agricultural monocultures where each part of the world, just uses essentially cheap energy to crank out in huge volumes, whatever it can most advantageously sell into global commodity markets. So I guess my whole argument is that, we need to, I don't like to talk about going back. It's not about sort of trying to, create some kind of chocolate box image of the past. It's about trying to deal with the problems of the present, by using more local, more low energy, more community focused routes. But I think that ultimately means, producing the things that we need more locally. That probably means producing them at a higher cost. And so then that, pushes into questions about the cost of labor, the cost of housing, the cost of land. But again, all of that stuff is so leveraged, sort of like, we had a farm advisor who visited us recently and we basically are not entitled to the subsidy regimen that, most most rich countries kind of prop up their agriculture with some kind of subsidy. We don't get that. So his next question was, can you rent? Have you got any buildings on the site that you can rent out? So it's this kind of rentier sort of trying to just use capital to make money rather than use land to produce, good, healthy agricultural products that people locally want. That's the way that capitalism has gone. So I think, we need to row back from that and create more of a kind of diverse local commercial societies. So for sure, I mean, it's almost like, when we talk about markets, the original idea of a market is like a physical place where you go to buy and sell things. And, we now talk about the market as this very abstracted global,
Sure.
Flow of commodity prices. So it's kind of, in a sense, trying to recreate those spaces of local marketing and not this notion of a sort of abstracted market, which, in many ways, as you said, or as I said in the book that you quoted, is a kind of bet against the future, which ultimately we're going to lose. I mean, we've just racked up so much debt against the notion that we're going to, sort of grow the economy in the future in ways that I think we probably won't. And that is going to lead to some big problems.
Well, I have, my sense is that the financialization that you just described, Chicago, that history of Chicago would be a great example of that. And and globalization, the ability for a peach grower in California to bring a peach to market more affordably in Georgia or South Carolina than a Georgia or South Carolina farmer could do. That seems to me that the peach grower in California who's operating at incredibly enormous scale, they are not paying the full cost of producing their peaches, whereas the small scale farmer tends to be paying something much closer to the full cost of producing their peaches. In the sense that, for at least in the United States, and having visited the UK not long ago, and I observed a lot of sort of Americanist infrastructure there that I had not seen when I visited for the first time in my early 20s. Like here, we, over 100 years ago, we started federally funding infrastructure that serves directly to enable globalized commerce, which is socializing the cost of our interstate highway system, which on the surface of it seems like, oh, well, that's great. Everybody can travel around. But what it really means is, with refrigerated trucking and whatever, a giant grower who has economies of scale no longer is restricted by the difficulty, the supply chain constraints. And then you expand that out, like we have giant shipping terminals. You do too, probably in Somerset, I would imagine, like enormous shipping terminals. Those are not like emergent things that just happen out as a result of a free market. That's a heavy public investment goes into those. And the same with shipping terminals for air travel, or the cost to elevate bridges above rivers so that that giant things can go in. It seems to me like when I hear people critique the impact that globalism has had on local economies, I seldom hear people describe how much public investment, sort of the socialization of the socialized cost of the infrastructure that enables it. I don't hear people talk about that, and also the flip side of that, the privatized reward that it has. We've sort of socialize the cost of producing and selling in a globalized market, but privatize the reward to the very largest and most asset-rich financialized corporations. Now there's generally no one owner of these things anymore.
Yeah. Well, that's true.
So that's my hypothesis. I'm curious your reaction to that.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. I mean, there's kind of two elements to that, but the one that you focused on mainly there, I agree, is this. I mean, we still have this sort of slightly frontier myth of the capitalist as this kind of individual entrepreneur who sort of spots a gap in the market and sort of, builds a factory and makes a lot of money and good luck to them sort of thing. But the reality is, we've moved into this world of essentially a sort of government and corporate, duality, this very tight relationship between central governments and big corporations. And, the food system is full of it. I mean, interestingly, I think the food system has less of it than in sort of manufacturing industry, because there are ways that you can't leverage as many economies of scale. It's still based on land, but nevertheless, it's still massively corporatized. And, things like, I was just writing about this the other day, the history of fertilizer, for example, is an interesting one. And it's interesting as well in that obviously part of this is competition between different countries, different governments to sort of stay ahead in the technological race. So, the synthetic, industrial synthesis of ammonia fertilizer was invented in Germany, the Haber-Bosch process, round about just before World War One. And that was because Germany was competing with Britain and with the US and, the other, major economies to sort of stay ahead in this kind of, technological industrial arms race. And it had a very well developed chemical industry, but not some of the other advantages that the other countries did. So, this real impetus to, revolutionize, agriculture in Germany. And it was developed by, Haber was a publicly employed chemist, but, it was very quickly turned into into a sort of private, industry that then sort of took the world by storm. But it took the world by storm. People now say, oh, well, isn't it great? We've got all this fertilizer. What would we do without it? Well, whether the world now could do without it or not is, a question we can maybe debate, but it wasn't necessary at that time. It was very much that kind of government to corporate pipeline that kind of suited the interests of both. It wasn't necessarily answering a fundamental agricultural problem. It was answering fundamental political and economic problems that were faced by the central state. But then the other side,
if I can add to that, or you may be about to say this, but if I can add to that, my understanding of that history is largely introduced to that by Will Harris. I don't know if you're familiar with Will Harris, White Oak Pastures in South Georgia.
No.
Regenerative farmer who's written a good bit. But in an interview, he's a fourth or fifth generation farmer, and he talks about his, if I have this right, his grandfather, probably his grandfather, talking about the introduction of chemical fertilizers and how it totally revolutionized their businesses. And you'd have to be insane not to embrace that technology, just like looking at what happened to it. But he went back a little further in the way what happened in the States, if I understand this correctly, was in anticipation of, or as a result of, or in anticipation or part of our involvement in World War II, massively ramped up production of weapons manufacturing, which leveraged a lot of those same technologies. And at the close of the war, we had built up these giant industries around weapons manufacturing that were largely, federally supported.
Yeah.
And had essentially paid to have all this infrastructure built to create massive chemical fertilizer manufacturing at an enormous scale.
Yeah.
And so they just kind of flipped from weapons to fertilizer. And am I right? Does that history sound right?
I think so. I mean, there's sort of layers and layers of that. There's partly the sort of manufacturing capacity. There's partly the fact that a lot of agricultural technology is actually barely translatable to warfare, fertilizers and explosives, tractors and tanks, barbed wire, do you know what I mean?
Right.
And so
That's
on.
interesting.
But the other side of it is a lot of agri-chemicals are basically labor saving. They don't, we talk about productivity or efficiency in a slightly slipshod way often. And they don't necessarily mean that you can produce more food per acre, but they generally mean you can produce more food per agricultural worker. But one of the other problems about it that that you were sort of alluding to, I think, in your earlier comments, is in terms of the externalities, is that, these, things like fertilizer, I can see how to farmers of earlier generations, it would seem like this wonder substance, but they have a lot of negative impacts in the environment. Pollution of watercourses, very destructive of wildlife, bad for human health,
Sure.
And that is the legacy that we're now wrestling with. And likewise with the labor saving aspect, in a situation where you have, a very rapidly growing industrial economy, there's lots of jobs, you can leave the farm and get a better paid job in the city, in the factory. That all kind of makes sense. When you're in a situation of a slowdown in growth, or, the end of economic growth, suddenly having lots of people living in the cities, not having access, to well-paid jobs, the idea of getting jobs out of agriculture suddenly doesn't seem so clever. And, that's kind of one of the main arguments for a small farm future is, there is a lot of, a lot of economic problems, a lot of social problems with, precarious and underemployment, in cities, and, rural communities that have been hollowed out, farming that's, absolutely pared to the bone, that race to the bottom I was mentioning. So if you put all that together, what we actually need is more people on the land. I'm not saying that fertilizers or agricultural technologies, modern technologies of one kind or another, I'm not saying that there's no place for them, but I think we need to think about them in a different way. Sort of find, rebalance the idea of labor saving with local community and localism. So that does, it all adds up. But we're now facing some real major environmental problems caused by agricultural technologies and fossil fuels, and the sort of political economic problems caused by that legacy of urbanization and industrialization, to which, I suppose it's my shtick, the answer to every problem is a small farm future. But, it's a sort of
it does seem kind of I guess, this could bring us to your most recent book. But it seems intuitively accurate to me that it is problems of scale or metastasized growth as opposed to duplicative growth. That are causing a lot of what a friend calls big blast radius problems. Like, it works until it doesn't work, and then the blast radius is enormous, and the cost to our environment or our future is significant.
Yeah, well, that's a good way of thinking about it, I think, because we are very locked into the big blast, big scale ways of doing things, but and as you say, it works until it doesn't work, and then when it doesn't work, boy, are we in trouble. So that's part of my argument, is that we need to be stepping back from that, the big blast as quickly as possible now. I think a small farm future is going to happen anyway in many places as some of these, chickens come home to roost. But if we don't plan for it and sort of make it happen by design, it's going to happen by default in all sorts of ways that are not going to be pleasant, so it's not, it can be a pretty negative vision of the future. So the challenge is to try and make it as positive a vision for the future as we can.
Yeah, where there is no future, the people perish.
Right.
I want to go to that topic, sort of getting there, and then also the theme of your most recent book, which I haven't read, which is Saying No to a Farm-Free Future. But before I do, and I don't even know if I have a question in this, but you make a few references to, and you have a background in anthropology, and you make a few references to David Graeber, the late David Graeber, who passed away maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
But and as you were talking about kind of a general sort of problems urban environments are having with underemployment there, I immediately thought about his writing on bullshit jobs,
right?
Which is one of my favorite things that he's written. And boy, how great would it be to have him still around talking about these things now.
Yeah.
But I don't really have a question around that, but I'm glad you made that connection. I don't know that I've come across anyone writing about agriculture, small farms, regenerative farming who've invoked Graeber. And
okay,
yeah. So can you tell me what you think about his connection, or the idea of bullshit jobs and its connection to this?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think. I've read quite a number of his books, and he's definitely an influence on me. The book that he co-authored with David Wengrow, what was it called? The Dawn of Everything,
right, was
also an influence in terms of this kind of historical oscillation between kind of hierarchy and, the kings or the kind of warrior castes kind of ruling the roost versus people having a more republican with a small r, more kind of self-organized local politics. And so I guess, my bid is for that self-organized local politics. In terms of bullshit jobs, though, yeah, I mean, it's a while since I read it, but I think, that is the nature of the modern world, is that, if you don't have access to food and energy and the other physical prerequisites of life, you need quite a lot of money in your pocket in order to buy them on the market. And so we've sort of got into this awkward situation where, economic growth is declining, that sort of great big sort of industrial, the French call it, the glorious 30 years after World War II, where, huge economic growth globally. And of course, that's been the case in China more recently. But when you don't have that, it gets harder to sort of keep, that economic show on the road. And in the short term, you can invent these kind of bullshit jobs where, people are earning decent money doing essentially quite pointless things. And, and then you get this kind of, bureaucratization of, everyday life, and the sort of, whether it's left or right, Democrats or Republicans, people talk about rolling back the state, but the state only seems to get sort of bigger and more sprawling and more, whichever party is in power. And that's part of this big blast dynamic. I think the kind of, the reach of the state spreading ever wider and sort of requiring more and more servicing, which ultimately doesn't achieve anything very useful or productive other than, the perpetuation of the state itself, So that's the argument, I think, for, again, your argument about scale, downsizing, sort of trying to step away from that, that sprawl, that bureaucratization, the bullshit jobs, into something that is, more manageable and, it's kind of interesting looking at, histories of, the collapse of, pre-modern states. There's a lot of differences, but, similarities as well. I'm just reading a book about it at the moment, the collapse of Rome, essentially, its blast got too big, it got too extended in too many ways, and then it kind of collapses, and the sort of narrative that we inherit from collapse, about collapse, certainly from those pre-modern states, because what comes down to us is the literate, the people at the top of the hierarchy saying, oh, this is terrible, everything's falling apart. But actually, for ordinary people, those collapses can actually be a blessing, in terms of the ability to have, to regenerate a more productive, a more congenial, a more local life that, isn't being kind of drained by the state or that kind of amplification of pointlessness that, that Graeber was talking about. So yeah, in lots of ways, he has been influential. Also, his book on debt, right.
That was the first thing I came to in his work.
Right. Yeah. It's a great book. Again,
so for listeners, David Graeber, I guess, about as famous as anthropologists become, but during Occupy Wall Street, he was a prominent figure during Occupy Wall Street, and I think he coined the term "we are the 99%" or something. So. Is that right?
Was part of that? Yeah.
Or part of it. He would probably never take credit. Would have never taken credit for something like that. But he was a prominent person there. He wrote a great book, Debt. The first 4,000 years, maybe that's what it's called.
5,000, I think.
5,000 years. Yeah, that introduced it, that makes an argument for how our understanding of debt and money has emerged. Why we have this modern conception of it, and looks at how there has been debt and money in all kinds of various cultures throughout the world. Yeah. And I know plenty of really brilliant people who take a lot of who think he reaches too far with some of his arguments. And at the same time, those same people would be very even if, as much as they might disagree with them about some things, they're very complimentary of his work. But he kind of stretched my view about how I think about a number of things.
Yeah, and then, I think the world is such a complex place. I'm very conscious of that, trying to integrate. What I can, and inevitably, nobody can sort of integrate all of this information. In fact, I think this is part of the problem that we have in the modern world, which maybe brings us on to the question you were going to ask about my more recent book is, there's this real sort of, temptation to sort of say, well, we've got all these problems, but don't worry, with my 3-point plan, I've got the solution. We just need to do, A, B, and C, and the reality is that that doesn't work. Things are too complicated, and there are no simple solutions. So I think we need to kind of get out of that mindset a bit and kind of embrace the open-endedness of where we are, and the fact that we maybe can't solve all of these things, but we can at least try and formulate directions or try and do our bit, or sort of try and figure out the best way to go.
I used to be an enormous fan of the quote by the American architect and planner. I'm blanking on his name, but it's the "make no small plans" quote. Like, make no small plans; they have no magic to stir men's soul. So like, you make big plans, which you need to make really big plans. Now I'm like, I don't know. I don't think we need to make any big plans. I think we just need to make small plans. Let's make small.
Yeah, and you can making small plans or doing small things doesn't have to be small. You can connect to the universe, and the universe is kind of embodied around us in all sorts of ways. And the spirit. It's not about sort of. It doesn't necessarily mean having to be unambitious in your horizons.
Right.
But,
right.
I think that's the key thing.
My brother Vince, he had, I don't know if it's his favorite poem, but one of his favorite poems is this great, beautiful poem called "Live by the Side of the Road and Be a Friend to Man." And like, that's his great ambition, and try to not be distracted by all the other stuff, and just sort of try and be a good neighbor. And I think there's a lot of when I read the big ambitious works of some, I'm a big fan. Stoicism is important to me.
Right.
I read a good bit of Stoicism, and I feel like what Marcus Aurelius was always just trying to do was, I just want to live by the road and be a friend of man, live by the side of the road and be a friend of man. And I think you're right. There's a way to have great ambition, and it's important to have ambition without trying to build something that's going to have a big blast radius.
Yeah.
But that's maybe a good time to come to the saying no to a farm-free future, which, if you're not paying attention to some of these things, it may sound absolutely insane that there's actually an extremely influential movement among, I guess, what would you call them, like influential policy type people, to get rid of farming, like to make it go away, and for us to extrude our food from vats. And but anyway, I haven't read your book, so I don't want to put words in your mouth about it. But if you can talk about saying no to a farm-free future.
Yeah, I mean, the book is a kind of polemic against that idea. It's specifically a polemic against a book called Regenesis by quite a well-known British journalist who's probably not quite so well known over in the US, George Monbiot. He sort of historically has been quite he's basically the only journalist with a sort of platform in the mainstream media who's pushing quite a radical environmentalist, quite a left-wing sort of agenda. And all of a sudden he has been making the case for these manufactured food. It's basically using, there's different processes. The one that he talks about mostly is using bacteria. You sort of, in a factory, you have a stainless steel bioreactor. You feed the bacteria various substances, most importantly oxygen and hydrogen, and they replicate, reproduce, and create this kind of slurry that kind of gives you a high protein powder, a bit like a sort of soy flour or something like that. But it's a bacterial process that uses up energy rather than land. So ultimately, part of the debate is about, what is the future of humanity looking like in terms of our needs, our impact on land versus our use of energy. It's also kind of an argument against livestock farming, or my argument is for mixed farming. Most historic agriculture's involved a mix of livestock and crops and rotations, so that's one element to it. But one of the issues with it is the way that I think that it's kind of, the political map is changing, and a lot of progressively minded people in the UK who think, oh well, George Monbiot has written about this, it must be good if they don't know about farming. But, there is these kind of realignments and in political realignments going on where people who historically maybe have been associated with the left and with progressive positions, who are therefore suspicious of corporations and the state, are actually kind of throwing their lot in with that. It goes back to that conversation we were having about, the fertilizer industry or whatever. And that, I think, sort of that change is worth signaling that, in some ways, the most interesting, powerful critiques of capitalism or the overmighty state and corporations, which maybe used to be coming from people associated with the left, are now coming from people who are more conservative aligned, or who are drawing on older traditions, Republican traditions or distributism or whatever. So this whole political map is getting very strange, really, to people who've sort of grown up with a sort of traditional left-wing, right-wing kind of framing of the world. And partly I wanted to signal that in the book. I'm like, what the hell is happening when, this kind of radical environmentalist journalist is suddenly talking up this very much a kind of a government to corporate pipeline that is going to create more monopolies within the food system than we already have.
Yeah, food would become, I imagine, I don't know if this is part of it, but I imagine food would become patented through that process.
Yeah, and to be fair to him, Monbiot says, well, I don't want that to happen, but it's kind of like, saying, I'd prefer the automotive industry not to be, a big corporate monopoly. Well, yeah, so would I, but how are you going to make that happen? That's where we need to build in, that another argument for a small farm future, that secure local access to land, that's not going to happen in these kind of, eco-modernist futures. I should say one other aspect of it I should mention is that it's an argument about nature loss and biodiversity loss. So the idea is that farming is very destructive of wildlife. So, wouldn't it be great if we could just abstract food, forget about farming, abstract humanity or humanity's reliance on the land to produce food. And that will enable, nature and wild things to prosper once again. And again, I understand why that argument is being made, but I think it's flawed at so many levels, which I probably don't have time to get into discussing. But it's this notion that humans are essentially causing destruction by our activities in the landscape. We need to sort of get out of the landscape and, produce our food industrially, and give more breathing space to nature. I certainly agree we need to give more breathing space to nature, but not necessarily by doing away with farming. Certainly aspects of farming, there is overproduction in farming globally, but that comes back to the economic models we were talking about. It's not farming intrinsically that is so problematic. It's that kind of, global economic framework, that race to the bottom, that kind of commodification of farming that is causing most of the problems.
I'm still trying to salvage the recording, but had a great discussion with a gentleman named Akiva Silver, who's a tree farmer in New York, upstate New York, and wrote a wonderful book called Trees of Power, it's just about growing trees, but it's also a bit of a manifesto. And he is, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but inevitably I will. Hopefully I'll be able to share this podcast, but he makes the big argument that our great problem is that humans are trying to live outside of nature, that we're trying to detach ourselves from the ecosystems. And his observation he found his way to farming as a naturalist, rather than a farmer or philosopher or anything. He was just but he was a naturalist.
Yeah. And
his observation, he began as a young man thinking like the places of greatest biodiversity and the places, the healthiest ecosystems are the ones where humanity has not touched it or we're far away from it. But his observation over time of, I'll have someone come to visit me. Let's see what happens here. His observation over time was that he saw the greatest biodiversity in areas where man had a presence. And it was a bit of a wake-up call for him and pulled him into farming. He sees, whether it's songbirds or deer or whatever, they're
Yeah. That's very much the final chapter of my new book lands in a very similar place to that. I argue essentially that we have to make ourselves kind of ecological protagonists. That if we try and abstract ourselves from that, I don't think that's going to end well for a whole bunch of reasons. And if we as humans, if we act as our best selves in terms of organisms in the landscape, what we are good at doing is creating biodiverse mosaic landscapes that provide a lot of niches and opportunities for other organisms. There's a great book just been published about the history of the Welsh landscape here in the UK by a guy called Carwyn Graves, and he makes that point that and it's kind of an interesting point in the context of my dispute with Monbiot, because there's this critique of too many sheep in the Welsh mountains that are very ecologically destructive, and that is possibly true. But that again is part of this history of agricultural overproduction and the sort of global market. So that, if you're a farmer in upland Wales, pretty much the only thing you can sell advantageously into global markets is lamb, is sheep meat. But there's a whole much more complex history of local land use, which is amazingly sort of encoded in the Welsh language that Carwyn discusses in his book. And so it's that kind of that's what we've got to reconstruct and preserve and build on is Aldo Leopold's famous phrase about being humans as plain members and citizens of the biotic community. We are part of nature, and we don't always behave very well as part of nature. So that we need to sharpen up our act, but sharpen up our act within the context of being ecological protagonists, sort of out here in the landscape. So yeah, totally agree.
Would it be part of Monbiot's, and he writes for The Guardian, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Would it be part of his argument, don't want to put words in his mouth either, and so I'll link to some of the things that he's written that kind of, we need to rewild the landscape, we need to increasingly urbanize, greater concentration of people in our cities and fewer in our rural areas. Is that right?
Well, I'm going to have to pick my words carefully here, because one of the problems with his book is that I think it's hard to see exactly what he is arguing, and he has been involved in a campaign run by a group called Replanet, which is now called We Planet. And they have a vision of the future where they say, we'd like to see a world where 90% of the human population lives in cities. Monbiot himself hasn't said that, and somebody reviewing my book put those words into his mouth, and he made he pushed back against that, which is fair enough. But my question to him would be, okay, so what is your, if you're not arguing for that degree of extreme urbanization, but you are, he's arguing very strongly really against most forms of farming. What is your vision for rural populations? And that he doesn't really make that clear. He does, he has kind of repudiated this notion that he's an eco-modernist or is sort of arguing for a farm-free future, and he does, in my view, kind of damn with faint praise, the more ecologically minded forms of agriculture. He has some positive things to say about aspects of it in the book. But he came to the major alternative farming conference in the UK a few years ago, the Oxford Real Farming Conference, which gathers together people involved in this sphere of agroecology. And, he basically said, you guys are like a bunch of typewriter salesmen, just before the invention of the microcomputer, So I kind of think, he's sort of trying to have, he's sort of trying to have it all ways in that book and say, oh no, I'm not against agroecology. But ultimately the whole drift of that book, it kind of says, well, maybe there's some ways that we can sort of farm that are kind of okay for nature. But ultimately, he lands very strongly on the manufactured food, as a way of trying to, essentially industrialize farming industrialize food production, so that, he talks about a counter agricultural, revolution. That chapter is called Farm Free, so that's very much the direction he's going in. And, there's a whole bunch of reasons why I think it's problematic, but I think it's technologically problematic because it's hugely energy intensive. It requires vast amounts of electricity. I mean, basically farming, what you're doing as a farmer is tapping the sunlight, which kind of comes to us for free,
Right.
It's a kind of carbon free resource. No farmer gets a bill through the post, charging them for the sunlight that lands on their land. Whereas you do have to pay the bill for generated energy, for generated electricity. So it's essentially saying, we're struggling to decarbonize the global energy system. And so this, the manufactured food argument is essentially saying, while we're struggling to wean ourselves off fossil fuels, instead of using free sunlight, let's use, our precious primary energy supplies to produce food instead of using sunlight. I mean, some of it is about using photovoltaics, and, we can get into the techie details of it if we had time. But, essentially it's instead of using the sunlight to produce crops, and a lot of this is about kind of alternative meat. There's a very clear corporate agenda, which is like, to do with producing meat substitutes, which gives corporations more direct control. But, you can do that with soy or with any number of other things. Why are we talking about, this very elaborate process of turning electricity into hydrogen, into bacteria, into protein powder when, we can be growing crops? The only real argument, aside from a corporate argument for it, is the land sparing argument. And that, as I argue in my book, is problematic for various reasons. So, that would be it in a nutshell. But it is this very different vision for the future. Yeah.
In one of your very recent blog posts, I actually just have the quote here. I don't have the post, but I think it was from January. You described that argument, or part of that argument is, I thought this was really brilliant, as replacing the quote, intermediary bioreactor of a cow's stomach with a stainless steel fermenting vessel in a factory.
Right. Well, yeah. And as I said, part of this is about sort of vegan arguments against animal agriculture. But, there is a logic to the vegan argument, which is that, if you grow a crop, feed it to an animal, and then eat the animal, that is less energetically efficient than if you just eat a crop. Now, there's a lot of complexities to that. I think, I'm not a proponent, a proponent of mixed farming that integrates livestock with cropping. And, that's a whole other debate, which I do talk about in the book, but it's almost an exact parallel where, instead of, eating the plant, we're, generating electricity to feed to the bioreactor to produce the protein. So that argument, the sort of vegan argument about, energetic efficiency, it does have some truth to it, if you are actually eating plants. But if you're eating manufactured protein, you start to lose that, particularly because a lot of them are based on using farmed substrates anyway. They use, genetically modified fungi that are fed on, sugar beet or, products like that, so you're not really cutting out the agriculture anyway. But yeah, it's another one of these techno fix things where people think that, we can invent a bioreactor better than the millions of years of evolution that have gone into a cow's stomach. Right. Which incidentally is another interesting aspect of this. I think there are potentially big problems with contamination with bioreactors. Cows have got an immune system that, that again has developed over long evolutionary time. Whereas if you're trying to, have this very, very pure, bacterial culture in a steel bioreactor, I'm not a biotech expert, but my sense is that one of the problems with this is, if you're trying to do it at scale to produce, huge quantities of protein that are going to feed people, en masse, it is very hard to keep that pure enough to stop contamination getting in. So, there's a lot of technical problems, with this technology and sort of some big question marks about the nutritional benefits, the whole kind of ultra processed food side of it, is, there's some issues there as well. So, but it's very much that kind of, human techno fix mindset that we can break this down into a whole set of technological problems that we can solve using, very, very high energy, very advanced modern technology, rather than, we can be ecological protagonists of a landscape. We can, we can produce food using well-known techniques that do leave some room for nature. If we get outside of this, the problems we face are not really technological. I think they're economic and political, sort of going back to the conversation we were having earlier. So I think it kind of misspecifies this as a technological problem. And, we don't really have the technologies to solve it. I don't think we don't have the energy resources, to go down this route. I don't think it's a great idea for a whole bunch of political and economic reasons as well. So yeah, as you can tell, I'm not a fan of manufactured food.
Well, I think that something that that impressed me in your first book was that I think that you do you do a good job of trying to put forward your antagonist's best argument, like to paint a real picture of what that person is like at their best. What is that argument trying to say? And then go after that argument, rather than so you steel man rather than straw man. And that was apparent through that book. And in the articles I've read that you talked about Monbiot's work, it seems like you do that as well.
Right. Well, I appreciate that. I have tried to do that. And I do appreciate, partly I think we get into this issue of the sort of agrarian future I talk about. It does sound to a lot of people like this kind of romanticized image of a past. And I think that's part of this sort of modernist progress narrative that it kind of trips us up in a lot of ways, because it's, it's not about trying to recreate any type of past society, but I think we can learn from them. They faced issues that we now face today. And, in terms of your blast sort of metaphor, I think it can be useful to look at societies that did have to source their needs locally, that, that didn't have sort of big global connections and high energy solutions. So, that's one part of it. But, I can see the argument that, we're so deep in this kind of modern high tech, high energy, urbanized world, that there's no alternative. But if, like me, you think, well, that's actually not going to work long term. I think
we're so far down that we've so heavily adopted the Ponzi scheme that we cannot stop adopting the Ponzi scheme. It doesn't seem like a good argument.
Yeah, exactly. I think it is a Ponzi scheme. Basically, it is that kind of, borrowing off the future that can only last so long, borrowing financially and economically. Yeah, exactly. And
environmentally, I mean, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I think we need to think outside that box as best we can. Even, I recognize that people are, it cuts against so much of what we've grown up with and been taught about, the way the world is supposed to work and how the future is supposed to look. But, I think this is the time to be doing that and to be trying to be more creative. It's not, it's as I say, it's not about sort of some unrealistic image of the past. It's about a more realistic image of the future. And in some ways, some of this sort of eco-modernist stuff, it's almost like, I think it's quite backward looking, and other people have made this argument. It's almost like, it's going back to the kind of 1950s space age sci-fi of, sort of, food sort of appearing out of nowhere, and, that kind of high modernist vision that never really came to pass, is still cooking away in a laboratory somewhere where people are trying to figure out this sort of manufactured food stuff. But I don't think that is going to be the path that humanity treads ultimately. And so, I think we're kind of wasting time and resources going down this dead end really with that tech.
I do have a great sense. My general sense, as much as I see that can sometimes bring me down, I also see an enormous amount that gives me great reason for optimism. And at the very least, people talking about these subjects that, I'm more familiar with the dialogue that's been going on here in the States, but, it was a get big or get out mentality with regard to American agriculture, really everything American. It must be done at large scale. It must be institutionalized. It must be corporatized. And the amount of talk, both talk and doing, that I'm seeing that's a reaction to that, to a return to human scale work, both in terms of agriculture, community, architecture, or built environments. It's just, to me, so much more than there was 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, it was so much more than there was 10 years before that. Mm-hmm. And so when I try to remind myself that the trend is our friend, it seems to me like, as many difficult things as there are, going on out there in the world, that there are a great many reasons for optimism.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. And I mean, there is a lot of things happening. And I think, one of the encouraging signs for me is a lot more young people getting interested in food and farming and sort of local environments and community building. But I think, this is a big battle in the sense that, there is this, big corporate push and governmental push, and a lot of people, a lot of sort of public intellectuals, surprising ones sometimes, who are enabling it, and that it's almost like that blast zone thing again. It's hard. There's so many people doing so many good things, but there's still the big money that is still talking at the moment. So it's kind of like trying to get on the right side of that and not allow that the big money and the sort of get big or get out mentality, which still has a lot of force globally, not allow that to, to crowd out those good things, but I agree, there's a lot of great things happening for sure.
Well, your voice is a great one to have. And I'm grateful to you for the work you've done, for the time you've spent with me this morning for me, I guess afternoon for you.
Yeah, thank you.
You have a lot more great, interesting things to share than we have time to cover. So if you would kindly remind people where they can find your work.
Yeah, I mean, my website is basically the place to go, Chris Smaje, all one word, SMAJE.com, and you can link to my books, and I write a blog, as often as I can, with quite a lively group of, commentators, on there. And
actually pretty civil, I'd say. They were civil and thoughtful commentators.
Yeah, no, it is. It's a kind of old style blog that I suppose it's sort of, you don't see so many of them these days. But yeah, it's a nice quality of debate, and generally, I try and keep it civil. They're a good bunch of people, so yeah, do join us there, or yeah, take a look at my books.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. Thank you for being on Yeoman, and I hope we'll speak again.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Likewise.